Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something tender, something complicated, and honestly, something that shouldn't have been nearly as dangerous as it was. Tonight, we're talking about what dating was like for black couples in the 1950s. And before you picture sock hops and milkshakes and some nice young man showing up at the front door with a corsage, let me tell you right now, the reality for black Americans was a completely different story. Same decade, same country, same stars overhead, entirely different universe. Because in 1950s America, falling in love while black wasn't just a personal milestone. It was an act of navigation, an act of endurance, and sometimes, depending on where you lived and who was watching, an act of quiet, breathtaking courage. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and whether your grandparents or great-grandparents ever told you the story of how they met. I'm always amazed at how many of those stories involve a church pew, a borrowed car, and somebody's mama who didn't approve. I read every single one of those comments, usually around 2 in the morning when I should be sleeping, but can't stop scrolling through your stories because they're that good. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Settle in. Maybe pull the covers up a little tighter, because tonight's story has warmth in it. Real warmth. The kind of warmth that comes from a kitchen full of good food and a living room full of people who love you. But it also has edges sharp enough to cut. And we're not going to shy away from those edges, because they're part of the story too. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what a first date looked like when you couldn't walk into most restaurants in your own city? Where did you take someone you were sweet on when the movie theater made you sit in the balcony if they let you in at all? What did it feel like to get dressed up on a Saturday night, knowing that the places you could actually go were limited to a handful of blocks? How did black men court black women in a country where a whistle, a glance, or a misinterpreted smile could get you killed? What was it like to fall in love under Jim Crow, where even your joy was policed? Did your grandmother press her hair for hours before a dance? Did your grandfather save up for weeks just to buy a suit sharp enough to turn heads? And what happened when the music stopped, the lights came up, and you had to walk back into a world that treated your happiness as a threat? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1955, somewhere in the American South. Maybe it's Memphis. Maybe it's Birmingham. Maybe it's a small town in Mississippi where everybody knows your name and your business and which pew you sit in on Sunday. You're young, you're single, and your heart has recently developed an inconvenient interest in someone across the church aisle. Welcome to Dating in Black America, where romance comes with a side of segregation, a heaping portion of community surveillance, and enough unwritten rules to fill a library that would never have let you through the front door anyway. Good luck, you're going to need it. But you're also going to love it. The first thing you need to understand about dating as a black person in the 1950s is that very little happened in private. And that wasn't just because your mama had eyes in the back of her head, though she absolutely did. It was because the entire structure of black social life was built around community. Not by accident, but by necessity. Segregation had walled black Americans off from white institutions, white businesses, white spaces. And in response, black communities had built their own world. Their own complete, functioning, deeply interconnected world. The church was at the center of it. The barbershop and the beauty parlor flanked it on either side like sentinels. The school anchored the next block, and somewhere nearby there was a dance hall, a juke joint, or somebody's living room where the furniture had been pushed against the walls and the record player was already warming up. This is where your love story begins. Not on some dating app, not in a bar downtown. It begins in the thick of a community that knows exactly who you are, who your people are, what your daddy does for a living, and whether or not your family pays their tithes on time. Romance in 1950s. Black America was a community event, whether you wanted it to be or not. And honestly, that was both its beauty and its burden. Let's start with the place where more black love stories began than anywhere else on earth, the church. If you grew up in a black household in the 1950s, church wasn't optional. It was as non-negotiable as breathing. You were there on Sunday morning for the main service. You were there on Sunday evening for the youth program. You were there on Wednesday night for Bible study. And you were there for every church picnic, every revival, every fish fry, and every holiday program from Easter to Christmas. The church was school, social club, news network, employment agency, and matchmaking service, all rolled into one building with a leaky roof and pews that creaked when you shifted your weight. And let's be honest, the matchmaking part wasn't subtle. The older women of the church, the ones everybody called Mother So-and-so, considered it part of their sacred duty to pair off the young people. They watched, they evaluated, they whispered. Mother Thompson would lean over to Mother Davis during the offering and say, in a voice that carried further than she intended, that the Johnson boy had been staring at the Williams girl for 3 Sundays straight, and somebody ought to do something about it before the devil got involved. And Mother Davis would nod gravely and say, she'd speak, to the girl's mother, as if they were negotiating a peace treaty rather than a potential first date. But here's the thing about church as a dating venue that nobody talks about enough. It was one of the few places where young black men and women could interact under conditions that everyone considered respectable. In a world obsessed with propriety, where a young woman's reputation could be destroyed by a rumor faster than a brush fire in August, the church provided cover. You weren't sneaking around, you weren't being fast. You were participating in the youth choir. You were both volunteering for the church picnic committee. You just happened to be walking to the same Bible study at the same time, 3 weeks in a row, by coincidence. The courtship rituals that played out in and around black churches in the 1950s were elaborate, coded, and surprisingly tender. A young man interested in a young woman didn't just walk up and ask her out. That would have been far too direct and would have invited immediate scrutiny from every adult within a 50-foot radius. Instead, he signaled. He might offer to carry her Bible after service, a gesture so classic it had practically become a cliche, but one that worked because it was understood by everyone involved, including the girl, her friends, her mother, the pastor's wife, and the usher who held the door open with a knowing look. He might save her a seat at the church supper, which required arriving early enough to claim a spot at her table and then defending that seat against all comers with the quiet determination of someone protecting a valuable investment. He might volunteer to walk her home, but only if her parents were within eyeshot, and he could frame it as a gentleman's courtesy rather than romantic pursuit. The girl, for her part, signaled back with a subtlety that would have impressed a diplomat. A smile held a beat too long. A laugh at a joke that wasn't particularly funny, which told him she was paying attention to him rather than his comedy. An accidental brush of the hand while passing the hymnal, accidental in the way that a chess master accidentally places a piece in the perfect position. She might mention to a friend, within earshot of his friend, that she was thinking about attending the church picnic next Saturday, which was an invitation disguised as a statement disguised as casual conversation, and everybody within a 10-foot radius understood the code. The whole thing moved at a pace that would drive a modern teenager to absolute madness, but it had its own logic. Slow was safe, slow was respectable. And in a community where respectability wasn't just a preference, but a survival strategy, slow was wise. Rushing things suggested desperation. Desperation suggested poor judgment. Poor judgment suggested you weren't ready for the responsibilities of a serious relationship. And in 1950s Black America, a serious relationship was the only kind worth having, at least publicly. Whatever else happened in private. The public courtship followed a protocol as formal and as carefully observed as any diplomatic ceremony. There were also the church-sponsored outings that served as group dates, though nobody would have used that term. The youth group trip to the lake. The choir's bus ride to sing at a sister church in the next county. The church bazaar where young people worked the same booth and found themselves with hours of proximity and a legitimate excuse for conversation. These events were genius-level social engineering by the church elders, who understood that young people needed supervised opportunities to interact, and that the church's role was to provide those opportunities while maintaining plausible deniability about its matchmaking function. If someone asked whether the church was running a dating service, the deacon board would have been horrified at the suggestion. If someone asked whether the church was aware that its events consistently produced romantic pairings, the deacon board would have smiled and said the Lord works in mysterious ways. Now, let's say the church matchmaking network has done its work. The mothers have conferred. The fathers have been consulted. Word has gotten around that a certain young man has honorable intentions toward a certain young woman, and her family has not immediately shut the whole thing down. Congratulations. You've cleared the first checkpoint. Now comes the hard part. Actually going on a date. And this is where the 1950s gets complicated for black couples in ways that the standard nostalgia never bothers to mention. If you're picturing a young black couple pulling up to a drive-in diner where a girl on roller skates brings them milkshakes, you need to recalibrate your imagination immediately. That drive-in, whites only. That diner on Main Street with the neon sign and the jukebox in the corner. Whites only. The movie theater downtown. You could go, maybe, but only if you entered through the side door and sat up in the balcony, which was typically the hottest, most cramped section of the building, with sight lines so bad you could barely see the screen. The park with the nice benches and the big oak trees. The benches were marked. The water fountains were marked. Even the air felt marked. So where did you go? Where did black couples in the 1950s actually go to fall in love? The answer is everywhere and nowhere. Everywhere because black people are endlessly creative and resourceful, and they weren't about to let Jim Crow steal their joy. And nowhere because the options were genuinely, infuriatingly limited. The first and most reliable option was somebody's house. House parties were the backbone of black social life in the 1950s, especially for young people. And these weren't the kind of parties where someone's parents were conveniently out of town. These were organized, sanctioned, often chaperoned affairs. Someone's mother would clear the living room, push the couch against the wall, roll up the rug if there was one, and put out a spread of food that could feed a small army. Deviled eggs, pimento cheese sandwiches cut into triangles, cookies, maybe a punch bowl filled with something red and sweet. The house would smell like furniture polish and whatever was cooking in the kitchen, and the particular warmth of too many bodies in a small room on a Saturday night. And then, the record player. This was the centerpiece of the operation. The record player sat on a table or a shelf, and whoever controlled it controlled the mood of the entire evening. This was a position of enormous social power, and it was typically held by someone who understood the rhythm of a party, who knew when to play something fast to get people moving, and when to drop something slow to give the couples an excuse to hold each other close. A good record player operator was the unsung hero of black social life, and a bad one could kill a party faster than a visit from the police. The music was everything. Rhythm and blues was in full bloom by the mid-50s, and the songs coming out of radios and record players in black homes were the soundtrack of an entire generation's love lives. Fats Domino, Ruth Brown, The Drifters, Ray Charles, Little Richard, Laverne Baker, Big Joe Turner, The Clovers, The Orioles. This was music built for slow dancing, for standing so close you could feel somebody's heartbeat through their Sunday best. And the variety was astonishing. In a single evening, you might hear a gut-bucket blues number, followed by a smooth doo-wop ballad, followed by something so energetic it could power a small generator. The transitions between songs were the fulcrum on which the social dynamics of the entire room pivoted. When a slow song came on, everybody watched to see who would ask whom to dance, and who would say yes, and who would be left standing alone by the punch bowl, pretending they didn't mind. The house party also served as a training ground for social skills that would serve young people throughout their lives. You learned how to make conversation with strangers. You learned how to navigate social hierarchies without getting crushed. You learned how to handle rejection gracefully, or at least without making a scene. Because making a scene at a house party meant that the story would follow you to school on Monday, to church on Sunday, and to the barbershop for the rest of the month. Boys learned how to approach girls with confidence that didn't tip into arrogance. Girls learned how to accept or decline attention with a poise that balanced warmth and boundaries. And everybody learned that the person who brought the best records was always welcome, regardless of their other social qualities. And the slow dancing. Let's talk about the slow dancing, because it was its own art form and its own battleground. A house party slow dance was one of the few socially acceptable ways for a young black man and woman to be in close physical proximity, and everybody knew it. The chaperones knew it. The other kids knew it. The couple definitely knew it. A slow song would come on, maybe something by the Platters or Johnny Ace, and a young man would cross the room with the kind of deliberate casualness that fools absolutely no one, and extend his hand. If she took it, they'd find a spot on the floor and begin the most carefully calibrated physical contact of the 20th century. Close enough to feel the warmth, far enough to keep the church mothers from having a stroke. His hand on the small of her back, but not too low. Her hand on his shoulder, but not draped around his neck. Both of them pretending to be casual, while their hearts hammered loud enough to drown out the bass line. There's something about a slow dance that cuts through every social barrier, and the young people at those house parties understood this instinctively, even if they couldn't have articulated it. In the 3 minutes of a slow song, you could communicate more than hours of conversation on a supervised front porch. The way someone leaned into you told you whether they were interested or just being polite. The pressure of a hand, the angle of a head, whether they closed their eyes or kept them open, these were signals as clear as words and far more honest. And when the song ended and you separated, both of you slightly flushed, slightly breathless, and the next song was something up-tempo that demanded a different kind of movement entirely. You carried the memory of those 3 minutes like a secret. It would sustain you through a week of work, of school, of navigating a world that didn't care about your feelings. The memory of that dance, that warmth, that 3-minute universe of two, was its own form of fuel. The rules around physical contact were strict, and they were enforced by everyone simultaneously. In black communities in the 1950s, a young woman's virtue was considered a family asset, and protecting it was a collective project. If a boy's hand drifted too far south on the dance floor, he wouldn't just hear about it from the girl's father. He'd hear about it from the girl's mother, her aunties, her older brother, the deacon who happened to be walking past the window, and quite possibly his own mother, who would get a full report by Monday morning through channels of communication so efficient they would have made the CIA weep with envy. But let's move beyond the house party, because black dating in the 1950s had layers, and some of those layers were a lot less supervised. Let's talk about the juke joint. If the church was where respectable courtship happened, the juke joint was where everything else did. Juke joints were informal establishments scattered across the Black South and in plenty of northern cities too. Sometimes they were actual businesses with something resembling a bar and a stage. Sometimes they were somebody's shack at a crossroads with a few cases of beer, a record player, and a string of bare light bulbs strung between two poles. The name itself likely came from the Gullah word for disorderly, and the reputation matched. Juke joints were where the blues lived. They were smoky, loud, dimly lit, packed tight with bodies on a Saturday night, and they operated in a moral grey zone that the church mothers pretended didn't exist. For young black couples looking for a place to let loose, the juke joint was liberation and temptation, wrapped in corrugated tin. The music was rawer here than at any house party. This was the Delta blues, the Chicago blues, the kind of music that talked openly about desire and heartbreak and bodies in ways that polite society wouldn't allow. The dancing was closer, the drinks were stronger, the chaperones were absent. If the church was where you fell in love, the juke joint was where you fell into trouble. Or at least, that's what the elders said. In reality, juke joints served a purpose that went far beyond sin and Saturday nights. They were one of the few spaces where black people could be entirely themselves, free from white observation, free from the performance of respectability, free to flirt and fight and dance and grieve and celebrate, without measuring every gesture against the possibility of white judgment. For young couples, that freedom was intoxicating in every sense of the word. But the juke joint carried risks too, and not just the kind your grandmother warned you about. Law enforcement in the Jim Crow South treated juke joints as targets. Raids were common, sometimes for legitimate violations like selling liquor without a license, and sometimes just because a group of black people having a good time on a Saturday night made somebody nervous. Getting caught in a raid could mean a night in jail, a fine you couldn't afford, and a reputation that followed you to church on Sunday morning. For young women especially, being seen at a juke joint could damage their standing in the community in ways that lasted years. The double standard was alive and well. A young man could spend Saturday night at a juke joint and show up to church on Sunday with nothing worse than a hangover and a knowing smile from the deacon. A young woman caught doing the same thing might as well have announced her retirement from respectable society. Now here's a detail that gets lost in most retellings. The juke joint wasn't just a building. It was a sensory experience so specific, so saturated, that people who went to them in the 1950s could describe them in detail decades later. You walked through a door, and the first thing that hit you was the smoke. Not cigarette smoke alone, though there was plenty of that. It was a layered fog of tobacco, fried fish, kerosene from the lamps, wood from a potbelly stove if it was winter, and the particular humid tang of a room full of people dancing hard in close quarters. The floor was usually wood, sometimes concrete, sometimes just packed earth, and it vibrated under your feet when the music picked up. The walls, if there were walls, might be covered with advertisements for hair pomade, soda pop, and patent medicines, tacked up alongside hand-lettered signs announcing upcoming fish fries or church revivals. The bar, such as it was, served corn liquor, beer, and sometimes something approximating a cocktail, though the measurements were approximate at best. And the music. The music in a juke joint wasn't background noise. It was the entire point. A guitarist sitting on a chair in the corner, bending notes until they sounded like they were crying. A harmonica player whose instrument seemed to speak in full sentences. Or a jukebox, the coin-operated kind that gave the whole establishment its name, loaded with 78s by Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, Little Walter, and whoever else had a record hot enough to make people reach into their pockets for a nickel. For a young couple on a date at a juke joint, the environment itself was part of the courtship. The dim lighting forgave imperfections and amplified mystery. The close quarters forced proximity. The music provided a shared emotional language that didn't require conversation. You could learn more about someone in 3 slow dances at a juke joint than in 6 supervised visits to their family's front parlor. Whether they held you tight or kept a respectful distance. Whether they moved with rhythm or shuffled like someone who'd rather be somewhere else. Whether they laughed when the music changed tempo, or whether they pulled you closer when a sad song came on. The juke joint stripped away the performance of respectability and revealed something rawer, something more honest. That's why the church mothers worried, and that's why young people kept going back. So the social geography of black dating in the 1950s was essentially a map with 2 territories. The respectable world of church, house parties, school dances, and supervised outings, and the shadow world of juke joints, after hours, spots, and anywhere else you could find a little privacy. Most couples navigated both, because love doesn't confine itself to respectable venues, and neither did desire. But the navigation required skill, and the penalties for getting caught on the wrong side of the line fell disproportionately on women. Some things never change, or at least they change far too slowly. Now let's talk about the beauty parlor, because if the church was the matchmaking headquarters and the juke joint was the testing ground, the beauty parlor was the intelligence center. Getting your hair done in the 1950s wasn't a quick errand. It was an all-day event, especially for black women. You went in on a Saturday morning and you might not come out until late afternoon. In between, you sat under a dryer that could double as a piece of industrial equipment. You endured chemicals that burned in ways the product labels didn't mention. And you participated in a conversation that covered everything from scripture to scandal with zero transition between the two. The beauty parlor was where women shared information about men, and the information was specific. Ruthie's daughter was seeing that boy from over on Maple Street, the one whose mother had that incident at the church picnic last year. Did anybody know if he had a job yet? Because Ruthie's daughter deserved better than a man who couldn't keep a job. And if somebody didn't say something soon, those two were going to end up married and living in his mother's back room. And wasn't that a shame? This was the intelligence network. This was where reputations were built, maintained, and occasionally demolished. A young man's dating prospects could rise or fall based on the consensus of a dozen women sitting under hairdryers on a Saturday afternoon. And that consensus traveled. By the time you left the beauty parlor, the news had already reached 3 churches, 2 barbershops, and someone's cousin in Detroit. The barbershop served a similar function for men, though the tone was different. Black barbershops in the 1950s were sanctuaries. They were places where men played dominoes, read newspapers, debated politics, discussed sports, and offered unsolicited advice about women to anyone young enough to still need it. The older barbers dispensed wisdom about courtship with the same authority they used to line up a fade. They'd tell a young man that a woman wants a man who shows up on time, who opens doors, who speaks to her mother like he's got some sense, and who doesn't try to rush things because a good woman is like a good suit. You invest in the quality, you don't grab the first thing off the rack. And then someone would tell a story about the time they tried to impress a girl by borrowing their uncle's car and drove it into a ditch on the way to pick her up. And the whole shop would erupt, and the young man would leave feeling both educated and slightly terrified, which was more or less the intended effect. The barbershop also served as an early warning system. If a young man was misbehaving, if he was running around with the wrong crowd, if he'd been seen at the juke joint when he was supposed to be at choir practice, the barbershop would know, and the barbershop would talk. And eventually, the barbershop's verdict would reach the young man's father, who would address the situation with the kind of directness that didn't require further explanation. Let's shift gears and talk about what black couples actually did on a date, because the options were both more limited and more creative than you might expect. In cities with established black neighborhoods, there was usually a black business district with some entertainment options, a black-owned restaurant or lunch counter, a black-owned movie theater, maybe a bowling alley or a skating rink that either catered to black patrons or had designated colored nights. In cities like Memphis, Chicago, Detroit, and Harlem, the options were considerably richer. Black neighborhoods in those cities had their own thriving entertainment economies. The Chitlin Circuit, that network of venues across the country that hosted black performers during the era of segregation, brought live music to black communities. You could see Muddy Waters, B.B. King, Etta James, Sam Cooke, and 100 other artists who were building the foundation of American popular music, all in venues that existed specifically because the mainstream entertainment industry refused to let black artists and audiences share the same space. A night out on the town for a black couple in a big city might mean dinner at a black-owned restaurant, followed by a show at a club on the Chitlin Circuit, followed by dancing until the early hours. And the fashion. The fashion deserves its own monument. Black Americans in the 1950s dressed with a precision and flair that bordered on the spiritual. A Saturday night out was an event, and you dressed for it accordingly. Men in tailored suits, sharp hats, polished shoes that caught the light. Women in dresses that had been planned, sewn, or selected with the kind of strategic thinking normally reserved for military campaigns. Hair pressed and styled to perfection. Earrings that caught every ray of light in the room. The effort wasn't vanity. It was a statement. In a world that treated you as less than, looking extraordinary was resistance. Every pressed crease, every perfect curl, every shine on every shoe was a declaration that you mattered, that your night out mattered, that your love mattered, regardless of what the law or the signs on the door said. And the preparation for a night out was a ritual in itself. For women, the process started early in the day, sometimes earlier if you count the trip to the beauty parlor the day before. The hair pressing alone was an ordeal that combined chemistry, skill, and a tolerance for pain that would impress a dental patient. A hot comb heated on the stove, drawn through, sections of hair with the precision of a surgeon. The smell of Dixie peach pomade and burning hair mixing in the kitchen air, while your mother or your sister or your best friend worked section by section, turning kinky hair into silk. One wrong move and you'd hear the sizzle of singed hair or feel the hot comb graze your ear, and you'd yelp, and whoever was doing the pressing would say, "Hold still," as if holding still while someone wielded a heated iron implement near your scalp was a casual request. Then came the outfit. If you were lucky, you had a new dress. If you weren't, and most people weren't, you had a dress that had been altered, updated, or accessorized to look new. Black women in the 1950s were absolute alchemists of fashion. They could take a plain dress, add a belt from one outfit, earrings from another, a scarf from a third, and create something that looked like it had walked off the pages of a magazine. And the shoes. Lord, the shoes. Heels that were polished, resoled, and repolished. Because you couldn't afford new ones every season, but you absolutely refused to look like it. For men, the preparation was less elaborate, but no less serious. A trip to the barbershop was essential, not just for the haircut, but for the ritual, the hot towel, the straight razor along the neckline, the aftershave that stung and smelled like ambition, then the suit. A good suit was an investment, and black men treated it accordingly. Suits were brushed, pressed, and hung with care. Shoes were shined until they reflected the ceiling. A hat was selected with the same deliberation as a chess move. The angle mattered. The width of the brim mattered. Whether you wore it tilted slightly left or slightly right conveyed something about your personality that words never could. Walking out the door on a Saturday night, dressed to the nines, knowing you looked good, knowing she was going to see you looking good, that moment was its own kind of power in a world that worked overtime to make black men feel powerless. But in smaller towns and rural areas, the options narrowed considerably. A date might be a walk after church, supervised from a porch by an adult who had both good eyesight and strong opinions. It might be attending a school event together, sitting side by side at a basketball game or a talent show, surrounded by classmates who would report every detail to anyone who asked. It might be a visit to the girl's home, where the young man would sit in the front room with the girl's parents present, making painfully polite conversation, while the girl's father assessed him with the kind of silent scrutiny that could make a person sweat through their only good shirt. The front porch was a classic dating venue. Sitting on the porch swing with your sweetheart while her mama kept one eye on you through the screen door was a rite of passage. You learned to communicate in half whispers. You learned that a hand held beneath the porch railing when nobody could see was worth more than a public embrace. You learned patience because the front porch move had exactly one speed, and that speed was glacial. For black couples attending historically black colleges and universities, dating had its own distinct flavor. HBCU campuses in the 1950s were vibrant, self-contained worlds where black students could experience something that was nearly impossible to find anywhere else in Jim Crow America: normalcy. On campus, you were surrounded by people who looked like you, who shared your experiences, who understood without explanation what it meant to navigate a world designed to diminish you. The social life was rich and structured. There were formal dances, homecoming celebrations, Greek life events, and football games that doubled as fashion shows and matchmaking opportunities. The homecoming queen election alone generated more political intrigue and passionate lobbying than most municipal elections. Fraternities and sororities played an enormous role in campus dating life. Pledge season, step shows, and Greek parties were all part of the courtship ecosystem. Being pinned by a fraternity man, wearing his fraternity pin as a symbol of their commitment, was a milestone that the entire campus recognized. It was the 1950s equivalent of going Instagram official. except the notification went out via the campus grapevine, which was faster and more reliable than any algorithm. The Divine Nine, those 9 historically Black Greek letter organizations, weren't just social clubs. They were networks, training grounds, and matchmaking engines that connected young Black professionals for decades. Many Black couples who met through Greek life in the 1950s went on to build families, businesses, and communities together, carrying with them the bonds formed on those campuses. But even on HBCU campuses, the 1950s rules applied. Women's dormitories had curfews, house mothers, and sign-out sheets. Men were not allowed past the lobby. Double dates were encouraged. And the campus rumor mill operated with an efficiency that would have impressed any intelligence agency. If you were seen holding hands with someone on the quad, it was common knowledge by dinner. If you broke up, condolences and unsolicited advice would start arriving before you'd even finished crying. The rituals of campus courtship at HBCUs in the 1950s were distinctive and deeply specific. There was the tradition of serenading. Fraternity men would gather beneath the windows of the women's dormitory at night and sing, harmonizing in the dark while young women leaned out windows or stood on balconies pretending to be unimpressed. It was theatrical and sincere simultaneously, which is basically the definition of courtship at any age. There were the Sunday afternoon promenades, where couples dressed in their best and walked the campus grounds in full view of the community, because being seen together was its own declaration. There were the homecoming dances, which were formal affairs with themes and decorations and live bands, and which required the kind of preparation that could occupy an entire week. Finding a date for homecoming was a process that involved strategy, negotiation, and occasionally the intervention of a well-connected sorority sister who happened to know someone who happened to know someone. The yard, that central outdoor gathering space on every HBCU campus, was the social hub where everything played out in real time, between classes, after lunch, on warm afternoons when nobody wanted to study. The yard was where you went to see and be seen. Groups formed and reformed. Conversations drifted. Flirtation was a spectator sport. A young man might walk past a group of young women and say something slick, and his friends would watch to see if it landed, and her friends would watch to see if she smiled, and the entire exchange was public theater with real emotional stakes. The yard was also where breakups became public record. A couple who stopped walking together, who sat on different benches, who avoided eye contact in ways that were obvious to everyone. That was news. And the yard delivered that news with the immediacy and reach of a broadcast network. The educational mission of HBCUs added another layer to campus romance. Many of the young women attending these schools in the 1950s were among the first in their families to pursue higher education. Their families had sacrificed enormously to send them there. The expectation wasn't just that they'd get a degree. It was that they'd find a suitable partner, someone equally educated, equally ambitious, who could help them build the kind of life that previous generations had been denied. This wasn't cynical, it was practical. In a world where economic opportunity for Black people was severely constrained, 2 educated incomes were better than 1, and a strong partnership was a foundation for community building. The stakes of campus dating then weren't just personal, they were generational. Now we have to talk about the thing that hung over every aspect of Black dating in the 1950s like a shadow that never lifted. The danger. Because the truth is, for Black Americans, especially Black men, the simple act of being perceived as romantically interested in the wrong person, or in the wrong place, or at the wrong time, could be fatal. This wasn't hypothetical. This was documented, repeated, historical fact. The murder of Emmett Till in August 1955 is the case that seared itself into the American consciousness, but it was far from an isolated incident. 14 years old, visiting relatives in Mississippi, allegedly whistled at a white woman in a grocery store. 3 days later, he was dragged from his bed in the middle of the night, beaten beyond recognition, shot in the head, and thrown into the Tallahatchie River with a cotton gin fan wired to his neck. His killers were acquitted by an all-white jury in just over an hour. And then they sold their confession to a magazine for money. That's the world black couples were navigating in the 1950s. Every black parent in America saw that story. Every black parent in America looked at the photographs of that boy's body that his mother insisted be published because she wanted the world to see what they had done to her son. And every black parent in America thought, that could have been my child. And for parents of sons, particularly sons who were approaching dating age, that fear didn't arrive as an abstract emotion. It arrived as a list of rules that they drilled into their boys with the urgency of someone teaching someone else how to survive a war zone. Because that's what it was. A war zone where the enemy wore badges and robes, and sometimes just the ordinary clothes of ordinary people who believed that the social order required the occasional sacrifice of a black life to maintain itself. The shadow of that violence shaped every interaction between black men and the wider world, especially any interaction that could be interpreted, misinterpreted, or deliberately distorted as crossing a racial line. Black mothers drilled it into their sons. Don't look at white women. Don't talk to white women. Don't be alone with white women. Don't walk on the same side of the street. Keep your eyes down. Keep your hands visible. Make yourself smaller. Make yourself invisible. This wasn't paranoia. This was survival instruction passed down through generations of experience, and the stakes were exactly as high as they sound. A boy who forgot the rules, or who didn't know them because he'd grown up in Chicago, where the rules were different, could end up dead in a river. That was the lesson of Emmett Till. Not that the world was unfair, which every black person already knew, but that the unfairness was lethal, and that it could reach into any room, any home, any bed where a child was sleeping, and snatch that child away. For black men dating black women, the danger was less direct but still present. A black couple out together in the wrong neighborhood could attract unwanted attention. A black man driving a nice car with a well-dressed woman beside him could provoke resentment from white observers who believed that kind of comfort should be reserved for their own kind. Even within black spaces, the threat lingered. Juke joints could be raided. Church gatherings could be disrupted. Any concentration of black joy was, in the eyes of certain white Americans, a provocation. And the unwritten rules went beyond where you could go. They extended to how you could behave. A black couple walking down a sidewalk in a town with any white population had to be aware, constantly, of the space they occupied and the impression they gave. Too much affection in public could be interpreted as defiance. Too much confidence could be read as uppity. Even the car you drove could become a problem. A black man in a nice car was automatically suspicious in the eyes of white law enforcement. "Where'd you get that car, boy?" became a routine question at traffic stops that were themselves routine harassments. If you were on a date, if you had your girl beside you, the stakes of that interaction multiplied. Keeping her safe meant keeping yourself small, and keeping yourself small on a date meant swallowing a kind of humiliation that no amount of sharp dressing or good cologne could wash away. black couples developed coping strategies that were passed down as informally as recipes and hymns. When driving through unfamiliar territory, you kept the radio low so you could hear if anyone was following. You didn't stop for gas in towns where you didn't know someone. You carried enough food and water to avoid needing to stop at a restaurant that might refuse you service or worse. The Green Book, that annual publication by Victor Hugo Green that listed safe businesses for black travelers, wasn't just a travel guide. It was a dating resource. If you wanted to take your sweetheart on a road trip, even a short one, the Green Book told you which hotels would let you sleep, which restaurants would let you eat, which gas stations would let you fill your tank without incident. The fact that such a book needed to exist is its own indictment. The fact that black people used it and thrived anyway is its own kind of victory. But here's what the history books don't emphasize enough. Black people loved anyway. They loved fiercely, creatively, tenderly, joyfully, and sometimes recklessly, because love is not a luxury that can be rationed by legislation. The extraordinary thing about black dating in the 1950s isn't the obstacles. It's that the obstacles never won. Not fully, not finally, not ever. For every law that tried to dictate where black people could go, there was a juke joint at a crossroads that stayed open anyway. For every sign that said whites only, there was a black-owned business that said everybody welcome. For every threat that tried to make black joy dangerous, there was a Saturday night dance where the music was so good and the company was so warm that the outside world, with all its casual cruelty and codified hatred, faded to a distant hum. Let's talk about the economics of dating, because money shaped black courtship in the 1950s in ways that were both practical and deeply unfair. The median income for black families in the 1950s was roughly half that of white families. Employment discrimination was legal, pervasive, and unapologetic. Black men were disproportionately concentrated in manual labor, service work, and agricultural jobs. Black women worked as domestic help, laundresses, and in other jobs that paid poverty wages. A young black man trying to court a young black woman had to stretch every dollar twice as far as his white counterpart, and he had to do it with half the options. Taking a girl out to dinner meant finding a black-owned restaurant that served good food at prices a working man could afford. Buying flowers meant walking past the florist on Main Street that wouldn't serve you, and finding someone in the neighborhood who grew them. A new suit for a dance might represent weeks of savings. A car, that ultimate symbol of 1950s American courtship, was often a shared family vehicle, borrowed for the evening with strict instructions about mileage, gas, and what time it needed to be back. Some young men didn't have access to a car at all, which meant dates were either within walking distance or involved public transportation that was itself segregated, often requiring black passengers to sit in the back of the bus or wait for a colored taxi. The automobile deserves its own extended discussion, because in 1950s America, having a car was practically a prerequisite for serious dating, and for black men, a car represented something even more complicated. A car was freedom. In a world where public transportation forced you to the back, where you couldn't hail a taxi in most cities, where trains had colored cars and bus stations had colored waiting rooms, your own car was a private space that belonged to you. It was the one place where you could control your environment completely. You chose the radio station. You chose the route. You chose when to stop and when to keep going. For a black man taking a woman on a date, the car was the great equalizer. Inside that car, with the radio playing softly and the streetlights sliding past the windows, You weren't a colored person navigating a white world. You were just a man with a woman he cared about, driving through the night. The car also played a practical role in dating safety. A couple in a car could leave a situation quickly if they needed to. They could avoid dangerous neighborhoods. They could drive to spots they knew were safe, places where other black couples congregated, a riverside lookout, a quiet stretch of road near the edge of town, a drive-in movie theater on the rare occasions when one admitted black patrons. The car created a bubble of privacy in a world where privacy for black people was nearly impossible to find. And yes, the car was where a lot of the physical intimacy that church mothers worried about actually occurred. Parking was a universal American pastime in the 1950s, and black couples were no exception. A secluded spot, a warm evening, a radio playing low, and the kind of privacy that a front porch could never provide. The community knew this happened. The community chose not to discuss it in specific terms. The unspoken agreement was that what happened in the car stayed in the car, as long as the car made it home before curfew, and as long as nobody ended up in a situation that would require a hastily arranged wedding. For young men who couldn't afford a car or didn't have one to borrow, courtship was more constrained, but no less creative. Walking dates were common and in their own way, more intimate than driving. Walking side by side through a neighborhood, you talked more because there was nothing else to do. You noticed things you'd miss from a car window. The garden someone was tending, the kids playing in the street, the old man on his porch who'd wave and say evening, and who you knew would report your presence to someone by the next morning. Walking also forced you to slow down, to be present, to match your pace to hers and let the conversation find its own rhythm. Some of the best courtships in the 1950s happened on foot. Two people walking through their community, being seen and being known and being part of something larger than themselves. And then there was the class dimension, because black communities in the 1950s had their own internal hierarchies, and those hierarchies influenced dating profoundly. The black middle class, small but fiercely proud, had its own social rules. Families who belonged to the right church, who were members of the right organizations, whose children attended the right schools, those families socialized together and expected their children to date within the circle. A young woman from a middle-class black family might be forbidden, not just discouraged, but explicitly forbidden, from dating a young man whose family was working class, regardless of his personal qualities. Class lines within black communities were policed with a vigor that sometimes rivaled the racial lines outside them. This internal stratification created its own romantic dramas. The middle-class girl who fell for the working-class boy and had to choose between her family's approval and her heart. The working-class man who put himself through school and slowly earned his way into social circles that had previously excluded him. The families that bridged the gap, where a teacher married a factory worker and the two worlds found a way to coexist within one household. These stories were common, and they added a layer of complexity to black dating that is often overlooked. Segregation forced all black people, regardless of class, into the same geographic spaces. The doctor's daughter and the janitor's son sat in the same church, shopped at the same stores, and attended the same community events. Proximity created possibility, but family expectations and social pressure created barriers. Love, as always, had to find its way through both. But here's where ingenuity stepped in, because black people have always been masters of making something beautiful out of limited materials. A date didn't need to be expensive to be memorable. A walk along the river at sunset cost nothing and could be more romantic than any restaurant. A homemade dinner prepared by a young woman. For a young man, she was sweet on, served in her family's kitchen, while her mama kept a watchful eye from the next room, was an act of intimacy that no fancy restaurant could match. A picnic in a black park, with food packed in a basket and a blanket spread under a tree, was simple and perfect and free from the humiliation of being turned away at the door. Music was free, or nearly so. A radio picked up the local black station for nothing. Records could be shared, borrowed, passed around a community until the grooves were worn thin, and the music itself was extraordinary. The 1950s were a golden age for black music, and that music was the connective tissue of black romance. Sam Cooke singing about being sent from above. The Platters asking if you're still mine. Fats Domino telling you he found his thrill. Ray Charles talking about a woman so fine she makes him lose his mind. These weren't just songs. They were the emotional vocabulary of a generation. Black couples in the 1950s had a soundtrack that was as rich, as complex, and as emotionally honest as any in history. And they danced to it in living rooms, at house parties, in juke joints, and on front porches, wherever two people could find enough space to hold each other close and sway. The radio deserves special mention because in the 1950s, black radio stations were doing something revolutionary. Disc jockeys like B.B. King in Memphis, who had his own radio show before becoming the king of the blues, and others across the country were curating the soundtrack of black life. They played the music. They read the announcements. They advertised the dances and the fish fries and the church events. They were the pulse of the community, and their playlists shaped what songs became the songs of that particular summer, that particular autumn, that particular heartbreak or falling in love. When a couple said that's our song, they were naming a moment in time as much as a melody. That song had come through the radio on a specific night, in a specific room, and it had woven itself into the fabric of their story. Black radio made that possible. It connected scattered communities into a shared emotional landscape, and it gave young lovers a common language of feeling that transcended geography. There was also the phenomenon of the record hop. Before the term was mainly associated with white teenagers, black communities were hosting their own versions, events where a disc jockey would play records and young people would dance. Sometimes these were school-sponsored. Sometimes they were held at community centers or in somebody's backyard. They were cheaper than hiring a live band and could be organized quickly, which made them perfect for the kind of spontaneous socializing that young people craved. A record hop in a black community in 1955 might feature the latest by Clyde McPhatter and the Drifters, Some Little Richard for the up-tempo numbers, and inevitably, when the night got late and the lights got low, something by The Moon Glows or The Five Keys to bring the couples together on the dance floor. Let's talk about the specific rituals and customs of black courtship, because they were distinct and they matter. In the 1950s, courtship in black communities followed a recognizable pattern, though the specifics varied by region, class, and family tradition. The pattern generally went something like this. A young man noticed a young woman, usually at church, school, or a community event. He made discreet inquiries through his network about her family background, her reputation, and whether she was already spoken for. If the intelligence was favorable, he'd begin what could only be described as a low-key campaign of visibility, showing up where she'd be, offering small courtesies, making sure she noticed him noticing her. If she responded positively, the next step was approaching her family. This wasn't a formality. This was essential. In most black families in the 1950s, a young man who tried to date a young woman without her father's knowledge or approval was asking for trouble of the most immediate and personal kind. The introduction typically happened through a mutual connection, often a church elder or a family friend who could vouch for the young man's character. The father would make his assessment based on criteria that were remarkably consistent across black communities. Does this boy have a job? Does he go to church? Who are his people? Does he treat his mother right? Can he look you in the eye when he speaks? If the answers were satisfactory, permission to call on the daughter might be granted. Not permission to date, permission to call. There's a difference. Calling on a young woman meant visiting her home, sitting in the front parlor or on the porch, and conducting yourself with enough decorum to satisfy adults who were watching your every move like hawks evaluating a rabbit in an open field. Conversations were polite, monitored, and mercifully brief. Over time, if the young man proved himself steady and respectful, the visits might become longer. He might be invited to stay for dinner. He might eventually be trusted to take the young woman for a walk or to a church event without a direct escort, though the indirect surveillance network never truly switched off. Going steady was a significant milestone that was recognized by the entire community. When a young black couple was officially going together, it was understood that they were exclusive. The young man was expected to behave accordingly, attending her family events, showing up at her church, and generally being present and accounted for. The young woman was expected to be loyal, supportive, and to conduct herself in a way that reflected well on both families. This wasn't a casual arrangement. Going steady in 1950s, Black America was a pre-engagement holding pattern, and everyone involved treated it with appropriate seriousness. Gift-giving was part of the courtship ritual, and it carried weight. A young man might give his sweetheart a ring, not an engagement ring, but a promise ring or a class ring, as a symbol of his intentions. He might give her a scarf, a bracelet, or a locket. He might save for months to buy her a bottle of perfume from the black-owned pharmacy, something with a name that sounded French and a scent that lingered in a room after she left it. The gift didn't need to be expensive, but it needed to be thoughtful. Showing up with something generic or cheap was a signal that you weren't serious, and that signal would be broadcast by the beauty parlor network within 24 hours. For her part, a young woman might bake for her young man, cook a special meal, or knit him something: a scarf, a pair of socks, a sweater that took weeks of work and that he would wear proudly even if the stitching was uneven, because the imperfections were proof of how much time she'd spent thinking about him. The exchange of handmade gifts was especially valued because it represented time and care, two commodities that mattered more than money in communities where money was scarce. The role of the Black church in formalizing relationships cannot be overstated. Engagements were announced from the pulpit. Weddings were community events that brought entire congregations together. And the pastor's opinion of a young man's suitability carried serious weight. If the pastor liked you, doors opened. If the pastor had reservations, those reservations had a way of circulating through the congregation at a speed that defied physics. Some pastors took their matchmaking role seriously, actively encouraging certain pairings and gently discouraging others. Whether this was pastoral care or meddling depended entirely on whether you were on the approved list. Let's talk about the differences between dating in the North and dating in the South, because the geography mattered enormously. In the South, segregation was the law. Jim Crow was codified, enforced, and visible in every aspect of daily life. The signs were literal. white and colored. The boundaries were physical. You knew exactly where you could go and where you couldn't, because the line was drawn for you, and the consequences for crossing it were immediate and sometimes violent. In the North, segregation was real, but less formalized. There were no signs on the water fountains, but there were neighborhoods where black families were not welcome, restaurants where black diners were not served, and social customs that enforced racial separation just as effectively as any law. The difference was in the packaging, not the product. But the packaging mattered because it gave northern black communities slightly more room to maneuver. In Harlem, in Chicago's Bronzeville, in Detroit's Black Bottom, there were thriving black entertainment districts where couples could go out and enjoy themselves with a degree of freedom that was simply impossible in most of the South. Northern black dating culture in the 1950s was influenced by the Great Migration, that massive movement of black Americans from the rural South to northern cities that had been underway since the early 20th century. Migrants brought Southern traditions with them: the church-centered courtship, the community surveillance, the emphasis on family, approval, but they also absorbed northern urban culture. The result was a hybrid. Northern black couples might observe traditional courtship rituals at home, while stepping out to jazz clubs and dance halls on the weekends. They might attend church every Sunday and hit the Apollo Theater on Friday night. The North offered options. Not equality, not justice, not safety exactly, but options. And for young black couples looking for a place to be young and in love, options were everything. Consider Harlem in 1955. The neighborhood was past its Renaissance peak, but still vibrant, still culturally electric. A couple on a date in Harlem could eat at one of dozens of restaurants that range from corner diners serving fried whiting to upscale establishments where the waiters wore white jackets and the menu included items that would have been impossible to find in rural Mississippi. They could catch a show at the Apollo, where any given week might feature performers who would go on to define American music for the next half-century. They could go to a dance at the Savoy Ballroom, where the Lindy Hop had been born, and where the dance floor was so famously democratic that it was one of the few integrated spaces in New York City. They could browse the bookshops on 125th Street, where the latest publications by black authors sat in the windows and the conversations about literature and politics and freedom spilled out onto the sidewalk. Or take Chicago's Bronzeville, the neighborhood that had become the capital of Black America during the Great Migration. Bronzeville, in the 1950s, had its own newspaper, the Chicago Defender, which was read by black people across the country. It had its own businesses, its own professionals, its own nightlife that rivaled anything in Harlem. A date in Bronzeville might start with dinner at the Palm Tavern on 47th Street, move to a show at the Regal Theater, and end at a late-night spot where the jazz was smoky and the conversations were long. The South Side of Chicago had a social structure that was sophisticated, layered, and intensely self-aware. Class distinctions within the black community played out in dating culture. Families associated with the black elite, the doctors, lawyers, educators, and business owners, tended to socialize within their circle. Their children dated each other, attended the same cotillions and debutante balls, and were expected to marry within a socially acceptable range. For families who were working class, the social world was different, but no less structured. Church affiliation, neighborhood reputation, and family respectability all factored into who was considered a suitable match. Detroit's Black Bottom and Paradise Valley had their own dating ecosystem built around the automobile industry. black men who worked in the auto plants had something that black men in much of the South didn't: steady union wages. That economic foundation changed the dynamics of courtship. A man with a factory paycheck could afford a decent car, a new suit, and a real night out. He could take his girl to a club on Hastings Street, where the Flame Show bar hosted performers on the Chitlin circuit, and the crowd was dressed like they were competing for best dressed in the nation. The economic stability that the auto industry provided, even in the face of persistent discrimination, gave black dating in Detroit a confidence that was palpable. You could feel it in the way people dressed, the way they moved, the way they talked about the future as if the future actually belonged to them. In the South, the social calendar for black couples revolved around institutions that black communities controlled. Church events were the bedrock. Homecoming celebrations at local black schools were major social occasions. County fairs sometimes had designated colored days, which was as degrading as it sounds, but also represented one of the few opportunities for black families to enjoy public entertainment. Fishing trips, river baptisms, harvest celebrations, and holiday gatherings all served as venues where young people could meet and interact under community supervision. The black high school was another crucial dating venue. Schools serving black students in the 1950s were separate and deliberately unequal, underfunded, understaffed, and operating with textbooks and equipment that white schools had discarded years earlier. But within those walls, teachers and administrators created environments where black students could thrive, and the social life that emerged was vibrant. School dances were major events. The homecoming dance, the prom, the Valentine's Day social. These were occasions that the entire community anticipated and celebrated. Students dressed in their absolute finest. Girls wore gowns that their mothers or grandmothers had sewn by hand, spending weeks on the detailing. Boys borrowed suits, polished shoes until they could see their reflections, and practiced their slow dance moves in the mirror when no one was watching. The prom was the pinnacle. For a young black couple in the 1950s South, attending the prom together was a declaration. It said, publicly and unmistakably, that these two people were a couple and that their families approved. The preparation was intense. Hair was pressed and curled and styled and restyled. Corsages were purchased, which represented a non-trivial expense for a young man working part-time for part-time wages. Transportation was arranged, which might mean a borrowed car, a hired taxi, or in some cases, a mule-drawn wagon freshened up with ribbons and wildflowers, because resourcefulness was not optional. And the dances themselves were magnificent. Black school dances in the 1950s were not stiff, awkward affairs. They were expressions of a culture that valued rhythm, style, and self-expression. The music was live when possible, recorded when necessary, and always chosen with care. The Lindy Hop was still alive and well. The slow drag was the couple's dance of choice. And the energy in those gymnasiums, decorated with crepe paper streamers and hopeful ambition, was electric. For a few hours on a Saturday night, the inadequacies of the building, the injustices of the system, the weight of everything that pressed down on these young people every other day of their lives, all of it lifted, and what was left was music and laughter and the particular kind of magic that only happens when two people look at each other across a dance floor and decide that the rest of the world can wait. The teachers who chaperoned these events deserve a word of recognition, because they were doing more than standing by the punch bowl, making sure nobody spiked it. Black teachers in segregated schools were community pillars. Many of them had advanced degrees from HBCUs. and could have pursued more lucrative careers if the economy had allowed it. Instead, they poured their education, their ambition, and their love into students who the broader society had written off. At school dances, these teachers watched their students with a particular kind of pride. They'd spent the week drilling algebra and conjugating verbs, and now here were the same kids, transformed by Saturday night alchemy into young men and women who looked like they owned the world. A teacher might see two of her students slow dancing and smile to herself, not because she was playing matchmaker, but because she understood that this dance, this moment of uncomplicated joy, was part of the education she was providing. Not everything worth learning could be found in a textbook. The after-dance ritual was its own chapter. When the lights came up and the music stopped, the couple spilled out into the night, and the real socializing began. Small groups would walk together through the neighborhood, nobody in a hurry to get home, the night air cooling the sweat on their foreheads while they replayed the evening's highlights. Who danced with whom? Who looked the best? Who had the nerve to ask out someone way above their league, and whether it worked? These post-dance debriefs were conducted with the analytical rigor of sports commentary, and they continued for days afterward, morphing and expanding with each retelling, until the dance had achieved a mythological status that the actual event, in its crepe paper modesty, had never intended. Let's talk about the role of food in black courtship, because food was love, and love was food, and the two were so intertwined that separating them would have been a sin against both. A young woman who could cook was considered a prize, not because black women in the 1950s were defined solely by their domestic skills, though society certainly tried to define them that way, but because food was the primary medium of care, celebration, and connection in black communities. A Sunday dinner invitation was a statement of serious intent. If a young man was invited to eat at his sweetheart's family table, he was being evaluated on every possible axis: how he held his fork, whether he bowed his head for grace without being told, how much he ate. Too little suggested he didn't appreciate the effort. Too much suggested he hadn't been properly fed at home, which was an insult to his own mother. Whether he complimented the cook, and how specifically. Whether he offered to help clear the table. The food itself was a showcase. Fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, sweet potato pie, macaroni and cheese baked until the edges were crispy. Ham hocks simmered all day until the meat fell off the bone. This was food that represented hours of labor, generations of tradition, and a culinary genius that was born in deprivation and perfected through love. West African cooking traditions that had survived the Middle Passage, been adapted in the kitchens of plantation houses, and evolved through centuries of making the most of the least. Okra from West Africa, rice cultivation techniques from the Senegambian coast, the art of seasoning that turned the cheapest cuts of meat into something magnificent. When a young woman's mother served this food to a potential suitor, she was offering him a history, and he had better appreciate it. The kitchen itself, in many black homes, was the heart of the courtship process. It was where the mother held court, where she could observe the young man in an environment she controlled completely. She'd watch how he ate. She'd listen to how he spoke. She'd note whether he pushed back from the table and thanked her, or whether he sat there expecting to be served like he'd done this 100 times and it wasn't special. In some families, the kitchen test was more important than the church test or the front porch test, because the kitchen was where pretense dissolved. A young man who could sit in your mother's kitchen and be natural, who could laugh at the right jokes and compliment the right dishes and help dry the dishes afterward without being asked. That young man had passed an examination that no school in the country offered and that no diploma could certify. For his part, a young man courting a young woman through food might bring her family gifts of things they couldn't easily get: a pound of good coffee, a cake from a bakery, fruit from a stand at the edge of town. These gifts were practical and symbolic simultaneously. They said, "I can provide." They said, "I pay attention." They said, "I'm serious enough to spend money I probably can't afford on people I want to impress." And in a community where resources were always scarce, that willingness to share what little you had was the most eloquent love language of all. Let me bring you somewhere specific. It's a Saturday evening in the autumn of 1955. You're in Memphis, Tennessee, and the air has that particular October quality where the heat of summer has finally broken and the evening carries just enough chill to justify wearing your good jacket. You've spent the morning at the barbershop where Mr. Collins took his time with your edges because he knows you've got a date tonight and he takes his professional responsibilities seriously. Your hair is perfect. Your shoes have been shined to a mirror finish by the kid who works the stand outside the shop, and you tipped him an extra dime because the shine was exceptional and because you're in a generous mood. You've borrowed your uncle's car, a 1949 Ford that you washed and waxed this afternoon until it gleamed like it just rolled off the assembly line, which it absolutely did not. You're wearing a charcoal suit that you bought on layaway at the black-owned clothing store on Beale Street, paying $1 a week for 3 months. Your tie is narrow and dark. Your hat is angled just so, tilted slightly to the left, because that's how the men in the magazines wear it, and because your mother said it made you look distinguished, which is the highest compliment she distributes. You pull up to a house on the south, adjust your tie. You wipe your palms on adjust your tie. You wipe your palms on your trousers because they're slightly damp, and you refuse to shake her father's hand with a wet grip. You walk to the front door. You knock, and then you wait, which is the hardest part, because waiting gives your brain time to run through every possible scenario, most of them involving her father, and none of them ending well. Her father answers. He's a man who works at the railroad yard and has hands like leather gloves and eyes that miss nothing. He looks at you for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then he nods once and steps aside to let you in. You sit in the front room. You make small talk with her mother, who offers you a glass of sweet tea and asks about your people. You answer carefully because you know this conversation is an audition and there are no second chances. Then she appears, and for a moment, everything else in the world dissolves. She's wearing a blue dress that her older sister helped her pick out. Her hair is pressed and curled and pinned in a way that probably took most of the afternoon. She's smiling, but not too much, because her mother is watching. You stand up when she enters the room, because your own mother would haunt you from the living room couch if you didn't, and you tell her she looks beautiful, which is both the truth and the understatement of the century. You drive to Beale Street. The street is alive tonight, the way it's alive every Saturday night, with music pouring out of doorways and people dressed in their finest moving between clubs and restaurants and pool halls. The street lights cast a warm glow over everything, and the sidewalks are crowded enough that you have to navigate through clusters of people who are in no hurry at all, because being on Beale Street on a Saturday night is its own destination, and there's no need to rush toward anywhere else. You can smell fried catfish from 3 different restaurants competing for the same stomachs. You can hear a trumpet solo leaking out of a club 2 blocks away, and closer, the thump of a bass line that vibrates in your chest. You take her to a small restaurant on a side street where the catfish is fried in cornmeal and the hush puppies are golden, and the sweet tea is so sweet it could qualify as dessert. The tables are small and covered with oilcloth, and the waitress knows your uncle and asks about him before she takes your order, because this is how things work in Black Memphis. You order for both of you, not because she can't order for herself, but because that's the custom, and she smiles in a way that tells you she approves of your choices. The food comes out hot and plentiful, and you eat and talk about church, about her classes at Booker T. Washington High, about the Louis Armstrong record you just bought and whether Armstrong or Ellington is the greater musician, which is the kind of debate that can sustain a conversation for an entire evening without anyone losing their temper. About the future, carefully, because talking about the future means talking about what kind of life you can build together, and that means talking about money and jobs and where you'd live, and all of that is tangled up in questions of opportunity that a young black man in 1955 Memphis can't fully answer. So you talk around it, you sketch outlines without filling in the details, and she understands, because she lives in the same world you do, and she knows the difference between a man who won't plan and a man who can't yet. After dinner, you walk down Beale Street together. The music is everywhere. Blues from one doorway, gospel from another, the new sound they're calling rock and roll from a third. You stop and listen to a man playing guitar on the sidewalk, and for a moment the song is so beautiful and so sad that neither of you says anything. You just stand there, shoulder to shoulder, letting the music say what words can't. Then you go to a dance. It's at a hall on the south side, a place run by a man everybody calls Big Junior, who hosts dances on Saturday nights and church breakfasts on Sunday mornings. Because in Black Memphis, the sacred and the secular share the same square footage. The band is playing rhythm and blues, and the floor is packed with couples who've been waiting all week for this moment. You find a spot near the back. She puts her hand in yours. You step onto the floor, and for the next 3 minutes and 20 seconds, the length of one perfect song, there is nothing in the world except the music and the warmth of her hand and the way she smells like jasmine and hair oil and Saturday night hope. You drive her home before midnight because her father's deadline is non-negotiable and because being late would undo every good impression you spent the evening building. The drive is quieter now. The radio is on, turned low, something mellow drifting out of the speakers. She's sitting closer to you than she was on the drive over, not quite touching but close enough that you're aware of every inch between you. The streetlights throw patterns across her face as you pass beneath them, and you steal glances when you think she isn't looking, which she is. She's been stealing glances too. That's how it works. You pass through blocks you know by heart, past the corner store that closes at 9, past the empty lot where the kids play stickball on weekday afternoons, past the church where you first noticed her, the stained glass windows dark now, but the building still holding its quiet authority over the neighborhood. You walk her to the door. You do not kiss her. Not tonight. Not on the first date. Not with her father undoubtedly stationed behind the screen door like a sentry who has been timing this evening with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. You tell her you had a wonderful time. She says she did too, and the way she says it, soft and steady with the faintest trace of a smile, tells you everything her father's presence won't let her say out loud. You walk back to the car. You sit there for a moment before turning the key, letting the night settle around you. You drive home through streets that are quieter now, the music fading behind you, the dashboard glow the only light, and somewhere between Beale Street and your uncle's driveway, you realize that you're going to marry this girl, and that the life you'll build together will be harder than it should have to be, and more beautiful than anyone expects. That's the thing about black love in the 1950s. It existed in a space between impossibility and inevitability. The system said no. The laws said no. The signs said no. The violence said no. And black people said yes anyway. Yes to love. Yes to partnership. Yes to building families in a country that considered their families expendable. Yes to dancing in rooms that shouldn't have existed. To music that shouldn't have been that good. Wearing clothes they shouldn't have been able to afford. With a joy they shouldn't have been able to feel. Every first date was an act of defiance. Every wedding was a revolution. Every child born was proof that no system, no matter how powerful, can legislate the human heart into submission. The welfare policies that would emerge in the late 1950s and accelerate in the 1960s would add another layer of cruelty to black family life. Those man-in-the-house rules that sent social workers knocking on doors to make sure no man was present, because benefits were denied to families where a father lived at home. Think about that for a second. A system that told black men to leave their families in order for their families to survive. A system that punished black love, that made partnership an economic liability, that incentivized absence, and then turned around and blamed black communities for fatherlessness. The perversity of it is almost too much to hold. But black families held it. They held it, and they pushed back against it, and they loved each other anyway, because that's what they had always done. Let's come back to the tenderness, because there was so much of it, and it deserves as much attention as the hardship. A black man in the 1950s who saved up for weeks to buy his sweetheart a birthday present. A black woman who stayed up until midnight pressing her hair because she wanted to look perfect for a Saturday night dance. A couple sitting on a porch swing in the summer heat, sharing a bottle of cola and talking about everything and nothing while fireflies blinked in the yard. These were ordinary moments, and they were extraordinary, because in a country that expended enormous energy trying to diminish black lives, every moment of tenderness was a triumph. Letters. Lord, the letters. In a time before cell phones and text messages, black couples who were separated by distance wrote to each other with a passion and eloquence that would make modern poetry blush. Soldiers wrote home from Korea with letters that ached with longing. Men who had migrated north for work wrote to sweethearts left behind in the south, promising to send for them as soon as they had saved enough for a train ticket and a first month's rent. Women wrote back with news of the community, updates on family, and declarations of devotion that they would never have spoken aloud in the presence of their mothers. These letters were treasured, saved in shoeboxes and dresser drawers, read and reread until the paper was soft as cloth. They were evidence, proof that love persisted across distance, across hardship, across every barrier that a hostile world could construct. The Great Migration itself was, if you tilt it at the right angle, one of the largest love stories in American history. Millions of black Americans left the South between the 1910s and the 1970s, and by the 1950s that river of humanity was still flowing strong. Many of those departures were driven by love in one form or another. A man who went north to find factory work so he could send money home. A woman who followed her husband to a city she'd never seen, because wherever he was, that's where home was. A young couple who packed everything they owned into a single suitcase and boarded a train heading north, because they wanted their children to grow up in a place where the schools had books and the sidewalks didn't have signs telling them where they couldn't walk. And in the wake of those migrations, love letters traveled back and forth along the rail lines like messages in bottles, carrying the weight of separation and the promise of reunion. A man in Detroit writing to his wife in Alabama, telling her he got the job at the plant, telling her he found an apartment on Hastings Street, small but clean, telling her to save up what she could and he'd send the rest for her train ticket, telling her he missed her cooking and her laugh and the way she hummed gospel songs when she thought nobody was listening. These letters were the emotional infrastructure of the Great Migration, the private correspondence that held families together across hundreds of miles. They're artifacts now, the ones that survived, tucked into archives and family collections, their ink fading but their feelings still sharp enough to cut. And when the reunions finally happened, when a woman stepped off the Illinois Central at Chicago's 12th Street station and saw her husband waiting on the platform in his factory clothes with a bouquet of flowers he probably couldn't afford, that moment contained more emotion than most novels. The relief, the nervousness of rediscovering someone you'd only known through letters for months, the strangeness of a new city, new sounds, new smells, new everything, softened only by the familiar warmth of the person standing beside you. Some of these reunions led to strong marriages that lasted decades. Others revealed that distance and letters had papered over incompatibilities that proximity exposed. But all of them represented a bet on love, a wager that two people separated by circumstance and geography could build something solid on the other side. For couples who formed in the north, the dynamic was different. These were people who met in the new cities, in the new churches that migrants built, in the factories and offices and neighborhoods that were being reshaped by the influx from the south. Northern courtship blended southern tradition with urban sophistication. A young man from Mississippi who'd been in Chicago for 2 years might still follow southern courtship protocols when approaching a young woman, asking to meet her family, showing up at her church, moving with deliberate respect. But he'd also take her to the movies without needing a chaperone. He'd take her to a restaurant where they could sit at a table and be served without incident. He'd drive her through the city in a car he was buying on installment from a dealer on the south side. The North didn't fix everything. Discrimination in housing, employment, and social life was real and persistent. But it offered a wider stage for romance, and black couples in northern cities used every inch of it. Let's pause here and talk about something that rarely gets discussed in histories of black dating: the role of humor. Because black couples in the 1950s were funny. They teased each other with a sharpness and affection that was its own love language. The verbal sparring between a young black man and a young black woman, what the older folks called talking trash, and what a later generation would call roasting, was a courtship ritual as elaborate as any formal dance. A man might approach a woman with a line so smooth it practically had its own soundtrack, and she'd cut it down with a response so quick and devastating that his friends would howl. And then he'd come, back with something even better, and she'd parry again. And the whole exchange was a kind of verbal dance that tested wit, confidence, and the ability to take a joke without crumbling. If you couldn't handle being teased, you weren't ready for a relationship. That was the unspoken rule, because life was going to be hard, and a partner who could make you laugh when things got heavy was worth more than a partner who could only recite pretty words when things were easy. This humor extended to the community's commentary on relationships. The older women at church who would look at a young couple and say, well, she could do better, but she could also do worse. And everybody standing within earshot would nod solemnly, as if this lukewarm endorsement was the highest compliment available. The men at the barber shop who would see a young man in a new shirt and say, must be a woman involved, because that boy never dressed like that for us, and the whole shop would erupt, the way a grandmother would watch a young man court her granddaughter and say, with perfect deadpan, "He seems nice, but let's see how he acts when the sweet potato pie runs out." This humor was a form of care. It was the community saying, "We see you, we're watching, and we love you enough to give you a hard time about it." There was also the reality of what happened when relationships ended, because not every courtship led to the altar, and breakups in close-knit black communities were public events, whether you wanted them to be or not. If a couple split up, the news traveled through the same channels that had celebrated their getting together. The beauty parlor would discuss it. The barbershop would weigh in. The church mothers would offer opinions that nobody asked for. A young woman who'd been publicly courted and then abandoned had to navigate not just heartbreak, but community pity, which was often worse. A young man who was known to have mistreated a woman would find his reputation traveling ahead of him like a wanted poster. The community didn't forget. Dating in 1950s, Black America was a high-stakes game, partly because the audience never left the theater. And then there were the couples who defied every convention, who shocked the community and didn't care, who loved outside the approved boundaries and dared anyone to say something about it. The woman who was older than the man she married, scandalous. The couple from different churches, practically an interfaith marriage in some communities. The man who married a woman whose family didn't have the right kind of reputation, a choice that could affect his own standing. These couples existed in every black community, and they reminded everyone that love, for all the rules that society tries to impose on it, ultimately follows its own logic. The community might cluck and frown and predict disaster, but when those couples proved them wrong, when they built strong families and happy lives despite the whispered disapproval, the community quietly adjusted its opinion and pretended it had been supportive all along. Let's also acknowledge the particular challenges faced by black women in the dating market of the 1950s. The economics of the era meant that black men who were educated, employed, and ambitious were in high demand. The ratio of what the community considered eligible men to the women who wanted to marry them was never quite balanced, and this imbalance gave certain men a leverage that some used responsibly and others exploited. A young black woman navigating the dating world in the 1950s wasn't just looking for love. She was calculating odds. She was assessing character with a rigor that would have served her well on Wall Street, if Wall Street had been interested in hiring her, which of course it wasn't. She was weighing his potential against his present, his promises against his track record, his charm against his substance. And she was doing this with the full knowledge that her choices were limited by a system that constrained both her options and his. Black women in the 1950s brought to courtship a combination of romantic idealism and stone-cold pragmatism that was remarkable. They wanted love, yes. They wanted tenderness and companionship and someone who made them laugh. But they also wanted stability, reliability, and a partner who could help them build a household that could weather the storms that a racist economy guaranteed. The beauty parlor conversations weren't just gossip. They were strategic planning sessions. Is he a good man? Is a question that sounds simple but contained. In the context of 1950s black womanhood, a universe of sub-questions. Can he keep a job? Does he drink too much? Does he have other women? Will he hit you? Does he respect your mother? Will he be a good father? Will he stay? These questions mattered because the consequences of getting the wrong answer were severe, and the safety net for a black woman who found herself in a bad marriage was threadbare at best. And yet, for all the caution and calculation, black women in the 1950s fell in love with an abandon that was beautiful and terrifying. They fell for the man who made them laugh at the church social, for the soldier who wrote letters that made them cry, for the boy from down the street who'd been carrying their books since 7th grade and had somehow, without anyone noticing, turned into a man. They fell in love because they were human. And being human means that the heart doesn't always consult the head before it makes its decisions. And the love they gave, fierce and generous and demanding and forgiving, was the foundation on which black families were built, one generation handing the blueprint to the next, and the weddings. When a black couple in the 1950s finally made it to the altar, the wedding was not just a ceremony. It was a community celebration. The church was decorated with whatever flowers could be found or grown. The bride's dress might be handmade or borrowed or bought on layaway. But it was always beautiful because the community demanded beauty and the community provided it. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall or in someone's yard, with tables groaning under the weight of food that a dozen women had spent days preparing. There was music, there was dancing, there was cake, and there was joy, the specific, hard-won, defiant joy of two people standing up in front of their community and saying, "We choose each other." In a world that offered black people few choices, that choice, freely made and publicly declared, was sacred. The preparations for a black wedding in the 1950s mobilized the entire community in a way that was part celebration and part military operation. The women of the church organized the reception with the efficiency of a catering company. One brought the potato salad. Another brought the greens. Someone's aunt made the cake, 3 tiers if possible, 2 if the budget was tight, and decorated it with the steady hand of someone who took this responsibility as seriously as the Surgeon General takes public health. The men set up chairs, strung lights if the reception was outdoors, and made sure the punch bowl was full, sometimes adding a contribution that the pastor didn't need to know about. Children were drafted as ushers, ring bearers, and flower girls, outfitted in clothes that had been starched and pressed until they could practically stand up on their own. The ceremony itself was a production that reflected the centrality of the church in black life. The choir sang, the pastor preached. The vows were spoken with a gravity that acknowledged everything these two people had overcome just to reach this moment. And when the pastor said, "You may now kiss the bride," the congregation erupted, because this wasn't just a wedding. It was evidence that life, in all its fullness and beauty, could flourish even in the harshest soil. The reception afterward was the party that everyone had been waiting for. The music shifted from gospel to rhythm and blues. The dance floor filled with couples who had been married for decades and couples who were just getting started. The old folks did the two-step. The young folks did something faster that made the old folks shake their heads and smile. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the bride and groom danced together for the first time as husband and wife. And the room got quiet for just a moment, because some things are too beautiful for noise. The tradition of jumping the broom persisted in some families, a practice that traced its roots back to enslaved people who were denied legal marriage and created their own ceremony of commitment. The broom itself was often decorated with ribbons and flowers laid across the floor at the foot of the altar, and the couple would jump it together, hand in hand, to the cheers of everyone present. To jump the broom at a 1950s black wedding was to honor those ancestors, to acknowledge the history that made this moment both miraculous and overdue. It was a gesture that said, "We remember where we came from, and look how far we've made it." Not far enough, never far enough, but farther than they said we could. So tonight, as you settle into whatever comfort surrounds you, think about what it means to love someone in a world that doesn't want you to. Think about the courage it took to hold hands on a segregated street, to dress up and go out when the places you could go fit on one hand, to dance slow in a room full of people who understood that the music had to be that good, because the rest of life was that hard. Think about the mothers who pressed hair and sewed dresses and cooked feasts because they wanted their daughters to feel beautiful on a night that mattered. Think about the fathers who sat in front rooms and interrogated young men because protecting their daughters was the most important job they'd ever have. Think about the barbershop philosophers and the beauty parlor intelligence agents and the church mothers who ran the most effective social network in American history, all without a single Wi-Fi password. They weren't just dating. They were insisting on a full human life in a country that offered them a fraction. They were building love stories in the margins of a narrative that tried to write them out entirely. And every kiss stolen on a front porch, every slow dance at a Saturday night house party, every letter mailed from Chicago to Mississippi with a 2-cent stamp and a whole heart was proof that the human capacity for tenderness is stronger than any law designed to crush it. So whisper a quiet thank you to the couples who danced in those juke joints and sang in those church choirs and loved in those small, fierce, beautiful ways that the history books too often forget. Thank them for the songs they danced to, for the food they shared, for the families they built with their bare hands and their unbreakable hearts. They navigated a world designed to diminish them, and they filled it with music and laughter and an elegance that Jim Crow could never touch. Think about the sheer improbability of it. A system that spent centuries trying to break black families apart, from the auction blocks of slavery to the man-in-the-house rules of the welfare state. And black families kept forming anyway, kept building anyway, kept showing up at each other's doors with flowers and nervous smiles and good intentions anyway. Not because they didn't understand the odds. They understood the odds better than anyone. But because the alternative, giving up on love, giving up on partnership, giving up on the possibility that two people could build something good together in a world that was often very bad, was simply unacceptable. Surrender was never the style. And the love they built had a specific quality that deserves a name. Though no one has found the right word for it yet, it was tender and tough at the same time. Romantic and practical. Full of poetry and full of common sense. A love that could slow dance to Sam Cooke on Saturday night and get up at dawn on Monday to face a world that didn't want you in it. A love that could write letters that made you cry and also stretch $1 until the eagle on it begged for mercy. A love that said, I see you, I choose you, and I will stand beside you no matter what they throw at us. That kind of love isn't just personal, it's political, it's revolutionary. It's the most powerful force in the history of a people who have been subjected to the most powerful forces of oppression and emerged time and again unbroken. Because love, it turns out, doesn't check the signs on the door. It doesn't ask permission from the law. It doesn't wait for a world that's ready. It just shows up, sometimes in a borrowed car on a Saturday night, sometimes on a church pew on a Sunday morning, sometimes in a letter that crosses state lines with nothing but hope and a postage stamp. It shows up, and it stays, and it endures, because that's what love does when it's real. And black love in the 1950s was as real as it gets. Close your eyes. Let the music fade. Let it fade the way a song fades on the radio when the signal drifts, slowly, gently, until it's more feeling than sound. Think of a warm night in Memphis or Harlem or a small town in Alabama whose name the maps forgot, but whose stories deserve to be remembered. Think of two people finding each other in a world that tried its hardest to keep them apart. Think of the miracle of that. Think of the audacity of it. Think of how much heart it took, and how much heart it still takes, to say yes to love when the world keeps saying no. And rest well tonight, knowing that the love they built didn't just survive the 50s. It built everything that came after. Every march, every song, every freedom. Every family gathered around a table on a Sunday afternoon, laughing about nothing and everything, connected by bonds that no law could break and no hatred could dissolve. They loved so that their children could live, and their children's children. And eventually, someday you. Sleep well. Good night.